Now that we understand entity types and attributes in an ER diagram, let's move on and start to discuss relationships. In an entity relationship diagram, the relationships are designated with diamonds. And when you have a diamond between two entity types, you can read them forwards and backwards the way you could an English sentence. So we note that an employee works for a department. We note that an employee manages a department. And let's try to do this a little more precisely by utilizing the numbers on the lines that connect the relationship to the entity type. The number 1 and the letters N and M stand for the cardinality. So, for example, here we have 1, and that is closest to the department entity. So we would read this sentence as an employee works for one department. Similarly, there's an N on this side of the relationship. We would use that cardinality when reading the relationship backwards. And we would say a department has working for it one or many employees. Now let's look at a different relationship. We will look at that relationship right there. And again, we will use the cardinality closest to the object of our sentence. So in this case, we will say an employee works on one or many projects. The N, of course, meaning one or many. Now, if we were to read that relationship backwards, if we were to say to read it this way, then the way we would read that would be a project is worked on by one or many employees. Now, you'll notice that the N and the M have exactly the same meaning. They both mean one or many. The reason we have an M and an N is just to remind ourselves that while they both mean many, in a relationship there could be different numbers for the many. So all we have to remember is that a 1 is 1, an N or an M is many, and we always read the cardinality closest to the object. Also notice that the entity type we start with, I refer to as the subject of our sentence, and the entity type that we end with, I refer to as the object of our sentence. That makes the diamonds, the relationships, verbs. But the tricky thing is, when you read it in one direction, the verb often makes sense. And when you read it in the opposite direction, you may have to change the tense of the verb. It may have to be a passive tense. So, for example, I would read an employee works for one department, an employee manages one department. But if I were to read those the other way, I would say a department has working for it many employees. Or I would read a department is managed by one employee. So don't forget when you're reading relationships that sometimes you have to invert that verb phrase. Now I want to move on to talk about double lines, because you've noticed some double lines here, and we want to discuss what those double lines mean. Here you see the relationship an employee manages one department. And that's how we read this sentence before. But notice that the line that connects employee to manages is a single line. A single line means partial participation. Partial participation. And what that means is that actually an employee does not have to manage a department, but if an employee were to manage a department, it would be only one department. So it might actually be better for us to say it this way: an employee may manage one department, because that partial participation implies that not every employee will manage a department. Here is the relationship expressed in the opposite direction, and we read this as a department is managed by one employee, which is correct. But you'll notice that the line that connects the department entity type to the relationship manages is a double line, whereas a single line meant partial participation. A double line means total participation. Total participation. And when you have total participation, you need to change your sentence a bit. And the way we will do that is we will change it from a department is managed by one employee to every department is managed by one employee. Because that double line means total participation. That means every single department in your system is managed by one employee. One thing that always gives new students of ER diagrams trouble is the fact that in every relationship there are two cardinality values and there are two participation values. And so it becomes really important to remember which ones to be reading as you read a relationship. This relationship is moving from employee as the subject to department as the object. And it's always important to remember that you read the cardinality closest to the object, but you read the participation closest to the subject. This is why the sentence for this relationship is an employee may manage one department. The fact that we said an employee may manage comes from the participation, the single line closest to the subject. That's the participation. And the fact that an employee may manage one department, that one is coming from the cardinality closest to the object. And so you can see what this looks like. The an and the may directly relate to that single line, and the one directly relates to that cardinality. What this means is that in this way of reading a sentence, we're ignoring two bits of information. We're ignoring that cardinality, and we're ignoring that participation. Here is the relationship expressed in the opposite direction, where we would say every department is managed by one employee. And again, notice that the participation is closest to the subject. In this case, we have every corresponds to that double line closest to the subject department. And we also have one employee, and the one is the cardinality that is closest to the object. So it's really important to know how to read a sentence that's a relationship. And when you do it, you're doing it for your business partner. You're trying to make sure that your business partner accepts these constraints on the data that you've described. For example, if you read every department is managed by one employee, Your business partner might say, well, that's mostly true. You should then say, mostly? Can you explain? And the business partner might say, well, sometimes we set up a department before we hire anybody. And if we set up a department before we hire anybody, we'll give it a budget. We will assign it to a floor of our building, but there won't be any employees yet. Well, all it takes is one exception to break this rule. And then you can't say that every single department is managed by one employee, because some departments will be managed by 0 employees. This means that you have to take that total participation and change it. You have to change that total participation, and you have to make it a single line now. And that single line would then change the meaning of your sentence. It would say, a department may be managed by 1 employee. This is why getting the ER diagrams correct and reading them back to the person who understands the data is very important.